Good evening and welcome to our webinar with Dr. Rashid Khalidi, who is the Edward Said Professor of History at Columbia University. هقول بس بالعربي. احنا الويبينار هيبقى بالعربي، أنا آسفة هيبقى بالإنجليزي. اللي عايز ترجمة بالعربي يدوس على علامة الكرة الأرضية، هيبقى سمعنا بنتكلم بالعربي. الناس اللي معانا على فيسبوك لو عايزين تسمعوا الترجمة بالعربي أرجوكم استخدموا اللينك اللي محطوط لكم في أول تعليق على فيسبوك. ادخلوا على زوم، لما تدخلوا على زوم هتلاقوا علامة الكرة الأرضية، هتدوسوا عليها هتسمعونا واحنا بنتكلم بالعربي. طبعا انا والدكتور رشيد احنا الاثنين طبعا بنتكلم عربي بطلاقه زي ما انتم شايفين، ولانه ده ويبينار في الجامعه الامريكيه واحنا وفي اجانب، ولانه اللغه الرسميه للجامعه الامريكيه هي الانجليزي، فاحنا هنعمله بالانجليزي. بنستسمحكم يعني، بس ممكن في النص كده نقلب عربي على بسيط. Hello everyone and welcome one more time. I want to thank my co-organizer, Khalid عز العرب, the director of the Middle East Studies Center at the American University in Cairo, for taking that initiative and for co-organizing. This is the second of a series that we had for Palestine, 1 year on after the war in Gaza. The first was a panel a week ago, and today we're having this webinar with the one and only Professor Rashid Khalidi. You can read the bio about Professor Khalidi, who is, as I said, he is the professor, the Edward Said Professor of History at the at Columbia University. A very recognized and accomplished academic. But before we start, let me tell you why Khalid and I were very keen on having Rashid join us. And he graciously, despite his very, very busy schedule, agreed to do that. I think Rashid is, and I don't use this lightly, but I think Rashid is one of a kind. For me personally, he's one of the few idols, and I don't have many. He is a public intellectual in a way that we lack in the Arab world. So we have very accomplished academics, and we have very dedicated activists, and we have amazing analysts. But very few actually have all those three qualities or are multidimensional the way Professor Khalidi is. So his book, The 100 Years War on Palestine, which behind him is the English edition, and with me is the Arabic edition. حرب 100 عام على فلسطين، قصة الاستعمار الاستيطاني والمقاومة, is a bestseller. I was pleasantly surprised. Not only is it a bestseller that the New York Times covers and whatnot, but I was pleasantly surprised last summer walking in the streets of New York. I passed by a bookstore, and in the window of that bookstore, while the war is ongoing in Brooklyn, for those of you who do not know, have a very strong foothold for a pro-Israel population, as well as, of course, a pro-Palestinian movement. But Rashid's book was in that window. One of the very few academics who writes a book that is legible, that is substantiated, well-researched, but also something that we can all access and read. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop here. متاح ترجمة باللغة العربية على زوم، اللي عايز يدوس بس على علامة الكرة الأرضية. In a personal conversation, and I'm not sure if I should share this, but I'm just gonna share it. Because he's one of my very few idols. I was asking him as an academic, very few Arabs have accomplished what he accomplished in terms of having an endowed chair at Columbia, which is one of the Ivy Leagues. And I asked him whether, looking back at all his accomplishments so far, what would be the moment that he, on his بعد عمر طويل إن شاء الله, on his deathbed, he will remember. And he said being in Lebanon in 82, where he used to teach before going to the US, and actually pushing against, in different ways, all of which is peaceful, against the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Very few academics will not cite their, the book or the accomplishment that's very individualistic, but actually would think of those collective moments and would define their own personal history through a bigger struggle that they believe in. Rashid was also one of the advisors during the Madrid process. So he has this very realpolitik sense of things. It's not just, a historian who does archival research. He does that, and he does it in an amazing way, but he also knows how to take that history and think about the moment politically. And with that commitment, for which someone like Gramsci would actually say an organic intellectual, for those of you who are interested in that. So I think in that sense, that's how I qualify him being one of a kind and a role model for many of us who are interested in academic research and in, books, but also in the real world and in having that kind of political commitment. I can go on, but I won't. Without further ado, thank you so much, Rashid, for taking the time. I know that we were competing with CNN and so many other, and again, he is very funny and he's very gracious, two of those personal traits that not many academics, especially academic men, have. So thank you, Rashid, for taking the time and being here with us. You have a huge audience that has been awaiting this. And as I told you before we started, that audience is very varied. We have people on Facebook from an activist community, researchers, academic community, AUC community. So you are very popular, and we would love to welcome you one more time in Cairo in person, maybe next year.
Inshallah.
Let me start by asking you that first question. In your book, again, a bestseller, for those of you who do not read it, please go ahead and buy the book and read it. You discuss the Palestinian, the Arab, and I like to say the Arab-Israeli conflict, with Palestine, of course, being the main protagonist, through 6 wars, right? And those wars, some of which are actually physical wars, like 67, but others are actually wars, like you think of the Balfour Declaration as a war.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward, you wrote this book before the longest war that we are still living. How do you see that process in relation to the ongoing war?
Well, thank you, Rabab, for having me, and thanks to everybody who is watching. I wrote the book long before this war started, and it may become the longest war. The war of 1947, 48, 49 was the longest, but it looks like this may become the longest, and it's by far the most devastating. When I wrote the book, I framed it in terms of 6 what I call declarations of war. So the Balfour Declaration, I see as a declaration of war on the Palestinian people. UN General Assembly Resolution 181 of 1947, I see as a declaration of war on the Palestinian people. And these are not declarations of war by the Zionist movement. They're declarations of war by Great Britain, the greatest imperial power of the age in 1917, or a declaration of war by a United Nations completely dominated in 1947 by the United States and the Soviet Union. So what I argue in this book is this is not a war between the Palestinians and Zionism or the Palestinians and the Israelis. It has always been a war in which the great powers were protagonists, were actors, were making war on the Palestinians. And in fact, the first declaration of war, the Balfour Declaration, is followed by the British Army, the Royal Air Force, and British might being used to crush the Palestinians from 1936 to 1939 during the Thawra al-Arabiyya al-Kubra of 1936, 1939, the Great Arab Revolt of 1936. So the war is declared by Britain on behalf of the Zionist project, but it's actually waged by the British Army and Air Force. 14 to 17% of the adult male Arab population of Palestine are killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled during those 3 years by Britain. So this is an example of the fact this is not a war just between, the Zionists, or later on the Israelis and the Palestinians. That's obviously important, central. But it is a war waged by and with the support of the great powers. And that's been true all the way through. That was true in 1967. Before Israel attacked Egypt and Syria and Jordan, the head of the Mossad, Meir Amit, went to Washington. He met with President Johnson. He met with Secretary of Defense McNamara. He met with General Wheeler, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He got a green light for Israel's attack on Egypt, on Syria, on Jordan. It was not an Israeli war. It was an Israeli fought war, a war that Israel fought. It was an Israeli-American war. Same thing is true for the 1982 war. Again, Ariel Sharon, defense minister in Begin's government, in May 1982, comes to Washington, meets General Haig, Secretary of State, tells him, we are going to expel the PLO from Lebanon. We are going to expel Syria from Lebanon. We're going to create a puppet government in Beirut. And Haig gives him a green light. I mean, the notes of Haig's chief of staff say green light. I'm not making this up. This is documented history. Everything I'm saying is documented history. Okay. In the book, there's 45 pages of footnotes. Whoever wants to see where I get these facts from, I give you the government documents from which I take these assertions. This war today is not an Israeli war. It's an Israeli-American war. Every 2,000-pound bomb with a guidance system dropped in Beirut or dropped in Gaza is an American bomb. Every plane is an American plane. I could go on and on and on. It's an Israeli-American war. So this is one of the reasons for my framing of this war on Palestine over 100 years. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is simply another phase in a war which has as its roots a settler colonial project that Western powers have always supported. And they still support, even though public opinion is turning against the governments that support it, whether in the United States or Britain or France or Germany or elsewhere in Western Europe.
I mean, this brings me to my second question, Rashid. I mean, there's that kind of ongoing support of the imperial powers, whether it's the British Empire or now the Americans, is ongoing despite all the popular support, and I'll come to the popular support and how that is different. But how can we understand that staunch support? I mean, just today or yesterday, the US, in the midst of all that, sends 100 of its personnel with more protection against missiles. I mean, what is that? I mean, do they hate? I'm going to reverse that question. Why do they hate us?
It doesn't have anything to do with hating or loving.
Mm-hmm.
There's an element of belief in many Western countries in the biblical roots of Israel. And so there is an element of belief, of love, and also of hate. But I think we have to understand this as secondary. Yes, the British cabinet in 1917 included people who believed that it was important to return the Jews to the Holy Land. But the reasons that Britain did what it did were not love of Jews or hatred of Arabs. They didn't care about Arabs. And they didn't particularly love Jews. I mean, I could talk about Balfour and the fact that he was prime minister under a government that passed the most anti-Semitic law in modern British history, the Alien Exclusion Act of 1906, which kept persecuted Jews fleeing pogroms in Russia from entering England. I mean, where's the love of the Jews? And where's the hatred of the Arabs? It's pure imperial interest, strategy. They needed to control Palestine in 1917 in order to defend what they saw the eastern frontiers of their Egyptian colony. Egypt was vital because the Suez Canal connected them with India. India is the jewel of the empire. This is strategy. This has nothing to do with love or hate. Today, the same thing is true. The United States sees Israel as a bulwark against its enemies in the Middle East, sees it as an ally, sees it as a strategic asset. It has nothing to do with love or hate. I mean, there is an ideological element. There's a brainwashing of public opinion and of elites especially. That's certainly part of it. And that leads to love and hate. I mean, an affection for Israel as so-called only democracy in the Middle East, and a hostility to Arabs and Muslims and so on. But that's not what's driving this. That helps them to justify what they do, which they do essentially for strategic and economic reasons, like all great powers act. So I think it's important to distinguish what's really driving this. Now, it's beginning to be argued in the United States that Israel is a burden rather than an asset. That you have American soldiers about to be in harm's way to protect Israel. So rather than Israel helping the United States is helping Israel at a cost to the standing of the United States in the world, at a cost to international humanitarian law, international law, a so-called rules-based international order. Where is a rules-based international order where tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians are slaughtered and nobody lifts a finger? Where's a rules-based international order where a sovereign state is being invaded, Lebanon, today? Obviously, the Americans look hypocritical, and this is a cost that Israel is imposing on them. So one day, maybe the strategic balance will shift, but right now, American elites see Israel as an asset, and they will defend it as a result, and support it and help it in its wars on Palestine and today on Lebanon and on Yemen. So I think we have to see it in terms of strategy and imperial interests.
Well, absolutely, but why aren't we a strategic asset? I guess that would be the question. Why, more than 100 years later, why couldn't we? And all the sacrifices put primarily by the Palestinians, right? But then there's all that support.
But
why
also by the Arab countries.
Absolutely.
Sacrifices also by Arab countries like Egypt,
but
Syria, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna ask you about the Arab countries in a minute, but my what I wonder, and I know others share that, why weren't we able to shift that balance and become that kind of strategic asset? And is there anything that's gonna tilt that balance into our favor?
I mean, this is a very, very hard question, because you're talking about, well, let me be very blunt. In a situation where you have, for the most part, Arab regimes that are not representative of their peoples, in a situation where you have a great deal of hostility to foreign control, going back to the days of colonialism, the United States seems to feel that it is in its interests to support autocratic, monarchical, dictatorial regimes in the Middle East. And these regimes are, to some extent, kept in power by the United States and by Israel. So the fact we don't have democracy in most parts of the Middle East, or it's very, very limited where it even exists, is one of the conditions which enables the United States and Israel to act as they do. And I'm turning your question around. In other words, what the United States is afraid of is the kind of things that Britain was afraid of in the past. Arab nationalism, Egyptian nationalism, Iranian nationalism, Turkish nationalism, and a desire not to have foreign bases on our soil, and a desire not to have our resources controlled by foreigners, a desire not to have elites that do whatever the West wants. And to combat that, the United States supports Israel and supports regimes that are not representative of the popular will. There are polls all over the Arab world done by a variety of reputable institutions, which show Arab public opinion is overwhelmingly favorable to the Palestinians and is overwhelmingly opposed to normalization or diplomatic relations with Israel, as long as it continues to oppress the Palestinians. Where are the Arab governments that represent that view? Very few, if any, I would argue. And if there is anybody who represents it, it's insurgent movements, it's resistance movements. So the existence of governments that repress that sentiment is vital to the United States and to Israel. It's absolutely essential that that opinion not be expressed by Arab governments, for example, boycotting Israel, for example, breaking their relations with Israel, for example, insisting that the United States cease to support Israel in the way it does. In fact, more than half of the Arab governments have some form of relations with Israel, which they will not break. I'm not just talking about the countries that have peace treaties: Egypt, Jordan, Bahrain, Emirat, and so on, Sudan. But there are others like Oman that have covert relations with Israel. There are many others that have that kind of, under the table relationship. Perhaps half the Arab countries, and preventing the public opinion that would opposes that by overwhelming majorities is a crucial task that these regimes perform on behalf of the United States and on behalf of Israel. I'm sorry to say.
I'll come back to the Arab countries, but let me be the devil's advocate for a minute. I mean, the reverse of what you're saying is what we saw and continue to see in the West, right? Popular, massive protest in support of Palestine, but then that did not also have an impact in terms of those governments declining to support Israel.
Right.
So my question being that this does not to say that because the Arab countries are repressing their people, even if those people were, that public opinion had an impact, we don't see that this translates into official positions. So what's the problem? And how can we build on that kind of moment of support that we see in the West?
First of all, Arab public opinion has been supportive of the Palestinians since before the State of Israel was created. You go back to the pre-World War I period, and you look at newspapers like Al-Haram. You look at newspapers published in Beirut, in Damascus, in Istanbul, in Arabic, before World War I, overwhelmingly supportive of the Palestinians and overwhelmingly critical of Zionism before the Balfour Declaration, before World War I. This is true in the 20s and the 30s. You have volunteers coming from Egypt and Syria and Lebanon to fight with the Palestinians. So Arab public opinion has been supportive of the Palestinians from the very beginning and still is. That's not true in the West. In the West, public opinion has been overwhelmingly supportive of Israel from 1917 until today, from Woodrow Wilson to Biden, from Balfour to Starmer. These countries, and not just their governments, the populations have been supportive of Israel for biblical reasons, for strategic reasons, because they were lied to and told things about Israel that are in fact not true, for a variety of reasons. Now, this has changed in the West, especially over the last few years, and in particular, since this genocidal war began last October. And you now have majorities in every Western country of public opinion, which opposes the war, opposes their government's policies, wants to stop weapons sales by these countries to Israel, which are the weapons with which Israel fights. It produces a small proportion of its own weapons. Most of the weapons they use are Western weapons, mainly American, but also British, French, German, and so on. Public opinion has just changed in the West. These are democratic countries, but public opinion doesn't control politics. Assemblies that were elected, parliaments that were elected years ago, presidents who were elected years ago, control politics. And elites that have not changed one bit control the media, control institutions, control our universities, and own our politicians. Legalized bribery is the basis of American politics. Huge amounts of money by rich people are necessary for the democratic system in the United States to function. So whatever the people think, the donor class, the rich who own our politicians in a certain sense, and who own the media, and who own the corporations, haven't changed. Public opinion has changed. The elites have not changed in the West. And you're right. I mean, having democracy does not mean that you're going to have a change necessarily in policy, because elites will continue, democratically elected elites, but elites nevertheless will continue to control policy. I mean, look at the United States. Public opinion was against the war in Vietnam from sometime probably in the late 60s. The war went on until 1975. Democratic opinion did not stop the war in Vietnam. Same thing happened with the war in Iraq. Public opinion changed in 2004, and the war went on and on and on. So even in a democratic system, because of its imperfections, it takes a long, long time for public opinion eventually to have an effect. And sometimes it will not have an effect. I mean, there are many things in this country which will not change, even though overwhelming majorities are opposed to them. And that'll be true whenever we have, inshallah, a democracy in the Arab world. You'll have elites that will dominate that system. And you'll have raison d'etat. You'll have people who say, we cannot do this because it will harm our national interests. And that's an argument that in some cases is reasonable. You know, do you want to go to war for this? Well, can we afford a war? And public opinion may say we support the Palestinians, but we don't want to go beyond this point. So democracy is not perfect, first of all. And elites still have enormous power in democracies. And it takes time for public opinion to have an impact. They're fighting back against the public opinion that was expressed in these huge demonstrations all across the West and all across the world. There's a powerful attempt to control the narrative and shift it back in a pro-Israel direction. So far, it's not working, but it is well-funded. It is well supported by political elites and by media elites, most importantly. And there's no guarantee that this public opinion will continue to oppose the war, to oppose the government's policy on the war, and to demand an end to arms shipments. You know, that could change. And that's one of the things about public opinion. It goes up and down. I mean, I would argue Arab public opinion has been pretty much solidly supportive of the Palestinians generally, but it goes up and down also.
So a year on, Rashid, are you telling me that we are doomed? So democracies, that public opinion, even though it's changing, that doesn't have an impact on policy. And in the Arab world, the public opinion, by definition, does not have an impact on the policy. So where does this leave us 1 year after the start of this genocide?
Well, two things. Firstly, public opinion in the democracy does have an impact over time. It takes time. I mean, I was a student. I opposed the war in Vietnam. It continued years after I ceased to be a student. But eventually, public opinion stopped the war. And you could argue the same thing for American wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Public opinion became violently opposed to these wars and eventually stopped them. That's the first thing. The second thing is, as you say, public opinion sometimes doesn't have an effect. Where are we? First of all, I would argue that Israel has put itself into a catastrophic strategic position. We mourn the terrible losses that have resulted from Israel's attacks on civilians in Gaza. Its ongoing attacks now on civilian populations in Lebanon. Not just killing them, but driving them from their homes. There's 1 million people in Lebanon who've been forced to leave. 1.2 million people have been forced to leave their homes. Almost the entire population of Gaza have been forced to leave their homes again and again and again. We mourn all of that. And we can argue and quibble about how we got here and why we got here. But what Israel is trying to do is unachievable. It is trying to impose by force a reality which by its very nature creates resistance. Occupation creates resistance. The occupation of Egypt created resistance. It took decades for Egypt to liberate itself from British troops, but it finally did. Same thing is true in India. The same thing was true in every colonized country. And it's particularly true in cases of settler colonialism, where what you're trying to do is replace the indigenous population. They didn't try and do that in India or in Egypt, but in Canada, in Australia, and in Palestine, and in Algeria, the attempt was to replace the population and impose a settler population. That kind of settler colonialism always inevitably produces resistance. And that's what the Israelis will not get into their heads. That more occupation and more colonization simply produces more resistance. Sooner or later, if it's not this generation, it will be another generation. I don't mean to be pessimistic and say this will go on for generations. But that's the case. The people fighting Israel in Lebanon today are the children who saw what Israel did in 1982. They're literally the children of Israel's occupation and of Lebanon in 1982, in which 19,000 Lebanese and Palestinians were killed and tens of thousands were wounded. This is the generation that grew up having seen those things. And what they're seeing now, children, is going to produce another generation of people who will, some of them won't and some of them will, but there will be resistance. So Israel has put itself, it's occupying more territory in Gaza and in South Lebanon with the expectation that this will end resistance. It simply creates more resistance. And I'm not speaking only from a Palestinian or an Arab or an American point of view, speaking from an objective point of view. History should teach us all that occupation breeds resistance, necessarily and inevitably. So they are in my view, an appalling strategic situation. They have created for themselves a monster, which they think they can deal with force and more force. That's false. They should have understood it by now. They obviously don't. And there are voices in Israel which are saying this, former generals, former politicians, Olmert, former prime minister. One reads in the Israeli press a few lonely voices telling them this is insane, this is suicidal. So I think we should look at it from that perspective, not from the perspective of where are we and how can we get out of this. I wish we could stop it tomorrow. But in my view, unfortunately, it's not likely to stop tomorrow or very soon. Maybe they'll realize the futility of what they're doing and stop in a month or a few weeks or several months. But essentially, the American-Israeli decision is to continue. I mean, you actually have heard idiotic terms out of Washington like escalation for de-escalation. Slaughter and kill and massacre so that you force the other side to de-escalate. I mean, that's actually the policy of the US government right now in Lebanon. Escalation for de-escalation. Well, good luck with that. It's not going to work.
I'm going to start taking questions from those who are graciously here, whether on Facebook or in the Zoom link. Please write down your questions. اكتبوا أسئلتكم بالعربي أو بالإنجليزي. هنبص على كل الأسئلة وأنا هقولها لرشيد وهيجاوب. يمكن ما نقدرش نغطي كل الأسئلة بس هقول مجمل الحاجات. I'm going to try to cover all the questions that you guys have. However, we might not be able to cover everything, so I'm just going to not repeat. So we have a question from our very dear former colleague, Ambassador Nabil Fahmy, who's asking what would be if you were to call for 3 to 5 steps, what would you ask of the Arabs to do in order to increase the support, the pro-Palestinian support in the West and build on that?
Multiple things. I think that Arab countries that have relations with Israel should reconsider those relations and tell the Israelis, If X happens, Y will happen. If the war continues beyond date, whatever, October 31st, our relations will be in jeopardy. I mean, very simple thing. Every single one of the Arab countries, whether they have secret relations with Israel or whether they have embassies in Tel Aviv, the minimum should be a complete freeze, if not a breaking of relations beyond a certain date. There must be a cost for Israel. The second thing is have an actual boycott. Say we will not allow goods to be that cannot move through Eilat because Eilat has been blockaded and closed. The port of Eilat is bankrupt. Goods are coming through Jordan. We will not allow goods to come to Israel via Arab countries, whether from the Emirat, whether from the Emirat, whether from Jordan, or whatever. I mean, the minimum is to say, if beyond date X, Israel continues to do ABC, bombard Lebanon, continue to occupy Lebanon, prevent Palestinians from returning to North Gaza, stop people from having food and starving them to death. If it does not stop these things, the second thing that should be done is a boycott. And the third thing is to make relations with the United States conditional on changes in American policy. The Arab countries allow the United States, by their acceptance of everything the Americans want, to support Israel with no cost to them in the region. Other countries actually try and impose a cost. The Turks try and impose a cost. Now they don't. I'm not trying to praise Turkish foreign policy, but they at least obstruct to some extent the Americans by saying what you're doing is completely unacceptable and saying it in a form and in a manner that's very hard for the Americans to reject. I could say much more. I mean, there should be on the part of especially countries like Egypt and Israel. Sorry, Egypt and Jordan. There should be serious reconsideration. I know that the Egyptian government is furious about what Israel has done with Rafah. That anger has to be raised to another level. And the same thing should be true with Jordan. But all Arab countries, I think, have the responsibility to do much, much more than they're doing.
This brings me to, I think, a very clever question that Rana here has, which is why do some Arab countries, most Arab regimes, I would say, support Israel, either, as you said, directly or indirectly by choosing not to take those stances?
I mean, it's a triangular relationship, in my view. طريق واشنطن تمر من تل أبيب. In other words, if you want the Americans to do what you want, which is what most of these regimes, that's their only interest, then you go and kiss the Israelis, and the Americans will then smile upon you. Well, you have to reverse that. You have to reverse that. First of all, this dependence on the United States is a function of a lack of legitimacy of Arab regimes. They're more afraid of their own people than they are of anything else. And many of them are dependent on the United States for their internal or their external security. I don't want to go into details, but there are countries that are dependent, if not on the United States, then on Israel for their domestic or their external security. There is an Arab country whose king has been protected by people trained by the Israeli intelligence services since the 1960s. I could go on and on and on. I mean, you have to untangle those dependencies on the United States and on Israel if you're going to have an impact. And that's part of the basic problem that we have in the Arab world. We are a region that is so strategically important and has such a great concentration of energy resources that great powers have always paid much more attention and put much more pressure on our region than literally any other region of the globe. So we face a burden as the Middle East, as the Arab countries, which is much greater than, say, Central America or some parts of Southeast Asia. They're important, but they're strategically important. They're economically important, of course. But the energy reserves, the strategic, I mean, one ship gets stuck in the Suez Canal and the whole world economy is affected. That's how important our region is. And that's why we have had the British, and that's why we've had the Americans and the Soviets and the French on occupying us, dominating us for so many years. And that's a heavy burden to carry and to overthrow.
Okay, we have like it's a sort of a few questions asking about the future of the resistance, of the Palestinian resistance and resistance in the region now, with all what we're seeing with Hezbollah and Hamas and whatnot. And to complement that, the future of the whole Arab-Palestinian conflict in absence of a united Palestinian authority, so to speak, or
Yeah.
a representation. You know, say what you may about the PLO, at one point of history, we had that. Today,
Right.
we don't have that. And you have worked closely with the PLO and with Arafat. And how do you see the future of the resistance and the leadership for that cause?
I mean, I'm not going to answer the resistance question beyond what I already said. I think that Israel has taken a course that guarantees the continuation of resistance, unarmed, nonviolent, and violent. Every occupation engenders resistance. Settler colonialism engenders an even fiercer resistance. Unless they literally destroy the entire Palestinian population, unless they literally empty South Lebanon of its entire population permanently, there will be resistance. It's inevitable. I'm not talking about today, tomorrow. I'm not talking about Hezbollah. I'm not talking about Hamas. I'm talking about historical inevitability. I don't predict the future. I'm a historian. I have no idea what's going to happen. But I can see this the way I see the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. I mean, these are historical inevitabilities. So the resistance question, I've answered already. The more interesting question, I think, or the more important question beyond my answer to that is about the Palestinian situation. One of the great problems we have is the disunity of the Palestinian national movement. Another great problem we have is the lack of a unified strategic vision for the Palestinian national movement. Let's go back. The Palestinians were unified in the 1930s in their revolt against the British. Eventually, the British and the Zionists created splits in the national movement, but the national movement was unified. The same thing was true from the moment that the first resistance groups grew up in the 50s and eventually came to dominate the PLO. The Palestinians had a unified national movement for decades, and it had a clear strategic vision. Initially, the vision was liberation of Palestine. It wasn't particularly sophisticated. It wasn't very clear. It then became a secular democratic state, which I think was a very clear strategic objective, and one that was shared by the entire Palestinian national movement. It then transited in the 1970s and 80s to a two-state solution. And that was a clear strategic objective of a unified Palestinian national movement. Now, that unified national movement broke down for many reasons. And that strategic objective of a two-state solution was foiled, in my view, having participated in the negotiations in Madrid and Washington as an advisor to the Palestinian delegation. That strategic objective foundered on the intransigence of Israel and the United States, which refused from the beginning until today to accept a sovereign, independent Palestinian state. Israel has never accepted that. It's never accepted Palestinian self-determination. It's never accepted full sovereign statehood. Rabin's last speech before the Israeli Knesset in 1975, weeks before he was assassinated, had two key points. He said, what we are offering the Palestinians is less than a state, aqal min dawla, and we will control the Jordan River. In other words, Israel's occupation continues. That's what Rabin was offering. There were two other Israeli prime ministers who were even willing to negotiate, Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert. Neither went beyond that limit, and never has the United States gone beyond that limit. Whatever the Israeli ceiling is the ceiling for the United States. I saw this in dealing with Aaron David Miller and Dennis Ross and Dan Kurtzer, the American diplomats who were charged with the negotiations in Madrid and Washington under Secretary Baker and later on under the Clinton administration. And we saw this in Oslo. This is what Oslo produced. It produced a Bantustan. That's all that Israel was willing to accept, a Bantustan. under Israeli sovereignty. It never was the idea of two completely sovereign, independent states side by side. That was never the Israeli objective. And the Israeli objective was the limit of what the United States was willing to do or press for. So the problem now is what should be the Palestinian strategic objective. And I'm not going to go there now. That's another whole other question. But the Palestinians suffer from the absence today of a unified national movement, a unified goal, a single unified goal, and a strategy for that unified movement to achieve that goal. And that's our problem as Palestinians. I would add one thing. One reason that Palestinian unity is so hard to achieve is because of external intervention by a variety of powers, regional and international, who have an interest in keeping the Palestinians weak and divided. Obviously Israel, obviously the United States, but also a variety of regional powers, Arab and non-Arab, who are playing in Palestinian politics for their own national interest.
I mean, that takes us to the question that you said, I'm not going to answer this now, but we have it here repeatedly about what should be basically that strategic objective. Is the two-state solution dead forever? What are we looking at? And we have different iterations of this. Some are actually saying that settler colonialism can actually succeed. We see the US. So what should be our strategic objective?
Settler colonialism can succeed. It succeeds when it entirely eliminates or completely subjugates the indigenous population. And you can only do that if you have an enormous population imbalance, as in North America, as in Australia, as in New Zealand. Otherwise, it cannot succeed unless you exterminate the population. I mean, Israel could do that. I doubt that in the 21st century it's possible, but they could try and do that. They came close to trying to do that in Gaza. Were it not for Egyptian and Jordanian refusal to accept people expelled from Gaza. I mean, this is something very important. What happened in the first weeks of the war, when Blinken went around and tried to persuade Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan that the expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza, in other words, the elimination of the population of Gaza through forcing them to flee, as happened in 1948. Their refusal of that was an enormously important position taken by these governments, in spite of the pressure from the United States. And nobody, I think, has fully recognized that. It's very, very important. They were achieving a national objective of their own, obviously, but they were achieving an objective that helped the Palestinians. Because nobody wants to leave Gaza. They don't want to leave Palestine, obviously. They saw what happened when people were forced to leave Palestine in the past. So settler colonial projects can succeed if they exterminate or completely subjugate the indigenous population. It did not happen in South Africa or Kenya or Algeria because they couldn't do that. And I would argue that it will not happen in Palestine because it's impossible, I hope at least, in the 21st century to entirely exterminate a population of many million people. So that's the first part of the question. As to what solution there is, I mean, first of all, we're very far from a solution right now. This war has made any resolution much, much more difficult than it already was. And I don't know when we're going to be coming close to a point where we can talk practically about a resolution. I personally think that the two-state solution had enormous flaws. I mean, I was involved in a negotiation myself for 3 years to try and achieve it in the early 90s. But I think that what has been done by Israel with the support of the United States and Western Europe in planting 700,000 Israeli citizens in the occupied territories. 1 in 10 Israeli Jews is a resident of these settlements in the West Bank and in occupied Arab East Jerusalem. How do you change that reality? How do you create a Palestinian state in a situation where Israel has taken over 60% or 70% of the West Bank and has planted 700,000 of its citizens in these militarily controlled positions dominating the entire West Bank? So someone who wants to talk about a two-state solution has to tell me how you're going to undo that reality that Israel has been working on for 57 years with the support and financing of the United States. So I think we may be beyond the point where a two-state solution is possible, even if it's desirable. Now, a one-state solution, how are you going to achieve that? You have two peoples whose enmity towards one another is much greater than ever before, especially after this war. So I have no idea on how you get there. I think that the only thing I can say is the only possible resolution is one that accepts that you have two national groups here. One group are settlers, but there are settler colonial realities like the United States, which have created nations. The Israelis have created a people, a nation. There wasn't a modern national entity before the Balfour Declaration, before the first Zionist Congress in 1897, but there is today. And I don't think that can be changed. So you have to have a solution where the two peoples can live in complete equality and in a situation of justice. Now, how you do that, I really don't know. I really don't know.
Now taking you back to history, Atiqa from Malaysia is asking how did the narratives, those Orientalist narratives, shape the anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab positions because of those perceptions, and how can we challenge those misinterpretations? Rashid, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I muted myself for a minute. That's a very hard question. How much time do we have, Rabab?
I know.
I mean, I could try and answer it, but those perceptions were built up over many, many centuries. They go back to the Crusades. They go back to, a hatred of Islam developed by Christian divines back in, a long, long, long time ago. So I don't think that I would personally, be able to tell you when and how those things developed. And I don't think I could tell you when and how they could be undone. They're enormously deeply rooted in Western civilization. They are going to be a problem for us long after the Palestine question is solved, hopefully with justice and equality, and hopefully very soon. But I think that this is a special case that goes beyond Orientalism. It involves the Bible. It involves a belief among especially many Protestants in the West that the return of the Jews to the Holy Land is a Christian duty. And that's a very hard, and you have that belief among American evangelicals and evangelical Protestants all over the world. It goes beyond the simple Orientalism that I think we could talk about. And that's going to be very hard to deal with. I'm not sure how it is to be dealt with. And it's a component among many. There is in addition been a quite sophisticated and long-term effort on the part of the Zionist movement and the state since 48, the state of Israel, to proselytize in the West, very successfully. They understood from the very beginning that this was a project that needed Western support. And that meant getting the support of Western public opinion. And so from the very beginning, with people who were Westerners, who grew up in the West, Herzl was an Austrian. He spoke German as his native tongue. Weizmann was a British subject. Golda Meir had lived in America. She was an American citizen. Abba Eban grew up in South Africa. You had Westerners crafting a Western narrative for Western audiences in a way that you really haven't had for the Arabs, ever. And this is a problem. I mean, I know that it's easy to blame, the PLO for having an unsophisticated propaganda apparatus or unsophisticated diplomacy. It's easy to blame the Arab countries. But to be fair, Zionism grew up in the West. Its headquarters and its motivation and its finance were Eastern European and Western European. And so they spoke to the countries of Europe and to the United States in their language through people who were, Benjamin Netanyahu grew up in Pennsylvania and in upstate New York. Spent half of his life in this country. He speaks English as well as I do, better maybe. The point is that this has always been a feature of the Zionist project, that they understood the need to speak to Western audiences. And it's something that I don't think the Arab countries or the Palestinians especially have fully appreciated. I think it's changing now. You have a generation that has grown up in the West of Arab Americans, of Arabs living in the Arab world, educated in the West, who understand how to speak their language, who understand what's needed to affect Western audiences, and who are having an effect. I mean, if you look at the number of books that are being published in English on Palestine, it's astounding in the last few years, astounding. Now, if they're being published, there are publishers that know that they'll make money, which means there's an audience for that. And so for the first time, you actually have a narrative which reflects the Arab world, which reflects the Palestinian story, which you never had in the past.
I think you answered a question that I've been seeing repeatedly by young academics here. We have someone even from Switzerland, an Arab, and others in Egypt saying, what can we do in terms of supporting the cause? And I'm just going to broaden that question, Rashid, because it's repeated throughout the chat. We have students saying, what should we do to continue our support? We, academics, activists, given, of course, that situation, because I think a lot of times we misinterpret the context. So in a context of a democracy where people can protest, what's actually doable is very different than in the context of the Arab region, for example, where you cannot protest, with our students. So so taking those kinds of limitations, what do those different audience, what should they do? And in answering that, there's a rising narrative in Egypt that says, which is, I think it's the defeatist narrative that says, the boycott, because there's an ongoing strong boycott movement, that this does not matter, that it's futile, we're shooting ourselves in the foot, or things like, Egypt have done so much already. What do you want us to do? Should we just go to war? So if you can speak a bit about the different options that we have short of war and protesting on the street, the multiplicity of options.
I mean, I'm not going to speak to what people should do in the Arab world, because I'm not the one who faces, repression and possible imprisonment and torture for opposing government policy. I mean, we know in the Emirates, we know in Saudi Arabia, we know in many other countries in the Arab world what the penalty for open dissent from government policy is. And it's not for me to advise people facing that kind of repression what to do. So I'm not going to speak to that at all. I'll speak to the narrative that you just mentioned, Rabab. But let me talk about what can be done in the West, because I actually think that a lot can be done. And I think a lot has been achieved. I think the fact that Germany, Great Britain, the Netherlands, and Canada have restricted arms sales to Israel over the past few months is enormously important. Now, these are governments that are very pro-Israeli. These are government decisions on the basis of overwhelming pressure from majorities of their publics to limit their support for Israel's war. That's not enough, obviously. And until you affect the United States in the same way, it doesn't really matter, because all of the major weapon systems are American. Every artillery piece is American. Every helicopter is American. Every warplane is American. Almost every bomb is American. So until you affect the United States in that way, which is not likely in the short term, you don't really stop the Israeli war machine. But it has an effect. If you read the Israeli press, you can see what kind of effect even minor things like boycotting Starbucks or boycotting McDonald's has on the bottom lines of these corporations and on forcing other corporations to break off their relations with Israel. When the Israelis feel themselves more isolated, it's true, they behave more extremely. But you have to impose costs on them. Whether it's what was done by Yemeni bombardments of Eilat and cutting off shipping in the Red Sea. They've closed Eilat. That's a cost. That's a cost. I'm not saying I favor it. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm telling you, it is a fact that that has imposed a cost on Israel for what it is doing. And it's not going to stop thanks to nice words. It will stop when the cost is higher than it is, much higher than it is now. And I think that the shift in public opinion in the West, continuing to push that shift, imposes a cost on them, whether it's in terms of boycotts or whether it's simply in terms of a realization that they are becoming increasingly unpopular. You must put this in historical context. They have had overwhelming support of public opinion in the West for over a century. This is a historic shift. It may shift back. I'm not saying it's permanent, but it is a historic shift, something of great importance, even if the governments are still refusing to reflect public opinion. So I think there's a great deal that can be done. And I have to say, I think it has to be done not with an eye to revolutionary purity and everybody has to agree on the most extreme position, but rather, how do you reach ordinary people in these societies? I don't think you reach ordinary people in these societies, which is the objective, I would assume, with certain kinds of slogans and certain kinds of approaches. I mean, I appreciate, sorry, I appreciate the radical purity of many people who are involved in this, and without their zeal and their enthusiasm and their willingness to be punished and to be repressed and to lose their scholarships and their housing and be kicked out of their universities, none of this change would have taken place. But I think that it's really important that you broaden the base of the opposition to what Israel is doing in the West. I mean, that's my advice. No, students don't listen to me. When I was a student, I didn't listen to older people either, so I don't expect them to listen to me. I didn't listen. I mean, when I was an undergraduate, we had very wise elders. The chaplain of Yale University, William Sloane Coffin Jr., one of the great figures in the anti-war movement, David Dellinger, one of the Chicago Seven, came to us as students who were protesting the Vietnam War and told us, please do this or don't do that. We didn't listen to them. So I don't expect students to listen to me either. But that would be my advice if they wanted it. As far as this narrative that you mentioned about, I mean, this is a narrative to defend the position of the Arab regimes that one way or another are complicit with Israel. Nobody's asking countries that have sacrificed to go to war. That's not the issue. I mean, the Yemenis have decided they're willing to sacrifice, or at least the leadership of Ansar Allah have decided they're willing to do this. The leadership of Hezbollah has decided they're willing to subject their countries to the kind of punishment that Israel imposes. But I'm not suggesting that that's the decision Arab countries shouldn't necessarily make. But I think they can do infinitely more than they're doing now. And this defeatist, as you put it, this defeatist narrative is intended to shield them from the pressure of public opinion that wants them to do more. And there is much more that they should do, and I think they're obliged to do for their own national interest, for their own legitimacy. If they want to pretend that they represent their own people, which some of them don't. I mean, there are countries in the Arab world which have the most absolute autocracies, the most absolute monarchies in history. They don't care about what their people think. But I would argue that much can be done and should be done. And these are ridiculous defeatist narratives. Let me say one more thing. One of the tragedies of the Arab world today is that a large number of Arab countries have basically been rendered almost, I mean, they've almost been destroyed in certain respects. Libya is not a unified state. Yemen is not a unified state. Syria is not a unified state. Lebanon is not a unified state. Iraq is not a unified state. These are countries that still are suffering from external intervention, from internal civil war. And by external intervention, I don't just mean the great powers. I mean the intervention of other regional powers. In every one of these countries, I've talked about 5 Arab countries. Sudan is the 6th. These are countries which, to expect them to do something on behalf of Palestine is frankly unrealistic. What can the Libyans do? They haven't even got a unified national government. What can the Sudanese do? They have their own, one of the greatest humanitarian tragedies of the 21st century. I can't expect the Iraqis or the Syrians or the Lebanese or the Yemenis or the Sudanese or the Libyans to take actions when they have these enormous crises in their own countries. And that's one of the tragedies of the 21st century and the late 20th century in the Arab world. The way in which these civil wars and this external intervention has rendered these countries, has shattered these countries. You know, once upon a time, you had strong regimes, undemocratic, but strong regimes in many Arab countries. And Israel was very afraid of them. Today, you do not have that situation in almost any Arab country. And that is part of our problem.
Does that make actually the decision? So I mean, I don't want you to talk about the decision, the October 7th, we're not going to go there. And I hope people understand this kind of contextuality of things, you know, between where we are and where we're located and the audiences we're talking to take that into consideration and understand how brave you are doing what you have been doing for years from New York. Having said that, Rashid, I cannot help but wonder, and again, this is part of that narrative that we hear a lot in Cairo, that the decision to resist is simply a stupid decision, given the kind of right-wing politicians and governments in Israel, how weak those different governments in the Arab regimes that are. So, you know, 1 year on, do you think that the losses that we have endured, and when I say we, again, this is a stretch, the Palestinians primarily, but then as a region, I still like to think of us as a region and the people. Would you think 1 year later we are in a worse off position than we were?
You know, if there were an alternative, which I mistakenly believed there was in the early 1990s, I would argue against certain forms of resistance. There is no alternative. There is absolutely no possibility of any conceivable Israeli government accepting anything but its domination of southern Lebanon and accepting anything but supremacy of Israel over the entirety of Palestine. It's a basic law of the state of Israel with constitutional force that only the Jewish people have the right of national self-determination. That was a law passed in 2018. With that, there is no future for the Palestinians except subjugation, colonization, domination, permanently into the future, is the only option being offered today by Israel and the United States. The United States can talk as much as it wants about a two-state solution. The United States finances a status quo of Jewish supremacy, hegemony, domination, colonization, and mass murder. The United States subsidizes it. The United States arms it. The United States protects it diplomatically. That's what's on offer. Either take that or shut up. There's no alternative being offered. I will not accept that American politicians who for 57 years have supported Israel's colonization of Palestine talking about a two-state solution. That colonization was intended in the West Bank and East Jerusalem to make a two-state solution impossible. If you want to have a two-state solution, you cut off the American 501c3 charitable institutions, which channel hundreds of millions of dollars tax-free to the settlements. You put restrictions on the use of American weapons in non-defensive situations. The United States doesn't do any of that. The United States is a participant in this colonization process by the money and the arms and the diplomatic support for it. So when they talk lyingly and hypocritically in Washington about a two-state solution, they don't really mean it. They mean whatever the Israelis are doing, we will finance and support in the Security Council. We will arm, and we will talk as if we are reading off an Israeli teleprompter. That's what the United States does. Ignore what they say. It's hypocritical lies. So in that situation where there is literally no alternative, how can you tell people not to resist? I'm not saying they should resist. I'm not saying they shouldn't. I'm talking as a historian. How could one expect the Algerians not to resist? How could one expect the Irish not to resist? I could go on. How could one expect the Egyptians or the Indians not to resist? I mean, you could say maybe there was an alternative, and when there was, they should have taken it. But we're talking about a situation today where there is no alternative. So I think it's a meaningless question, frankly. I would argue against much of what the IRA did in the Troubles in Ireland. I would argue against much of what the Front de Libération Nationale, حركة التحرر الوطني الجزائري, did during the War of Liberation against France. I would argue against much of what resistance is done in many countries. It's unwise, it's immoral, it's a violation of international law. But that's not the point. The point is resistance in general is something which I should obviously be considered in terms of the alternatives. When the Irish had the option of an Irish free state, a majority of them accepted. A minority wanted to continue to resist. The majority won. Ireland was freed. Part of Ireland was freed. When the Algerians had the option of Algerian independence, they stopped resisting. Before that, they didn't have that option. The Palestinians don't have that option. The Lebanese don't have an option. Israel is not saying, we will allow you to live in peace in your country. Israel continues to occupy a small part of Lebanon, and Israel imposes itself on the Lebanese. So I think you have to ask the question about resistance in terms of what the alternatives are.
I mean, that takes me to it's a repeated question here, which actually, believe it or not, it echoes in the Arab world, which is, but what we're seeing, and please, for the audience, رشيد عايش في أمريكا. الشيء اللي احنا بنعمله ده مسجل. حماس وحزب الله بالنسبة للأمريكان, where he lives and where he is an American citizen, terrorist organizations. فيا ريت نقرا بس الحاجات in that context. We're not gonna incriminate him, okay? Okay. So back to the Hamas and Hezbollah. There is that rising discourse that those two organizations, which do not represent, neither of them is democratically elected or not, that is actually Egyptian mainstream media, dragged their people to that kind of catastrophic situation where we're at. So that's part of the question. And then how can we see the future of this war, given the fact that it's now in Lebanon, the Iranians are, so are we talking about a full-fledged war?
Well, first of all, Hezbollah does win elections in the Shia districts of Lebanon. I mean, they have representation in parliament and in government, which is a result of a democratic. Lebanon is one of the countries that has, one of the few countries in the Arab world that actually has free and fair elections. It's a crazy skewed electoral system. It's a sectarian system that was devised by French colonialism, but it is in certain respects democratic. Palestine sadly had one election. Well, two presidential elections, one parliamentary election in 2005, 2006. That election produced a majority for Hamas in the Palestinian Legislative Council. They won 44% of the vote, but they won a majority of the seats. They didn't have a majority of the people, by the way. They had a majority of the seats. But that was then, this is now, that was 2005 and 2006. We're in 2024. So they have no democratic legitimacy. And there are polls that show that they were not very popular before October 7th in the Gaza Strip for a variety of reasons. But it's basically correct that a decision was made by a leadership of Hamas, and the leadership was made by the leadership of Hezbollah to enter into a war without consulting anybody, their own organizations, their people. Certainly the Lebanese people weren't asked. Certainly the entirety of the Palestinian people weren't asked. So I mean, I think that's a legitimate criticism. As far, what was the second part of your question about? Sorry.
This is turning into an open front war, a regional
war. Yeah. Well, it's turning into a regional war because Israel is escalating. At every stage, if you look at what actually is happening, Israel is negotiating a ceasefire agreement with Hamas, and it kills the negotiator, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran. I mean, who is escalating? Israel is negotiating a ceasefire via the mediation of the United States with Lebanon, and they kill the negotiator on the other side, say Ibrahim Nasrallah. I mean, who's escalating here? Again and again, the escalation comes from the Israeli side. Israel is expanding this into a general regional war, which, and Iran obviously is responding tit for tat. But when they bomb the Syrian embassy in Damascus, sorry, the Iranian embassy in Damascus, the Israelis, or when they attack in Tehran and kill the leader of Hamas, they are triggering an escalation. Why? And the Americans are letting them do it, supporting them in doing this. Why are the Israelis doing it? And we have to look at the domestic situation of Netanyahu. You have to look at his dream of making the United States fight a war for Israel with Iran. You have to look at his obsession with Iran, an obsession that is unfortunately shared by many people in the Arab world. I'm not suggesting Iran is a benevolent power. Iran is seeking its own interests, like any nation state, and those interests clash with the interests of other nation states. I'm not suggesting we should look benevolently on what Iran's doing. But what Iran does is what nation states do, what Turkey does, what Israel does, what with good guidance or bad guidance. That's not the point. What Egypt does, what Saudi Arabia does, what any nation state does. And Israel is constantly provoking Iran. Intentionally, I would argue, in order to goad Iran and other parts of the Arab world into a serious escalation. Into a regional war, which they hope to drag the Americans into. And we now have 100 American troops about to be stationed in Israel with these anti-missile defense systems. I don't think you can blame Hamas or Hezbollah as much as you want for, in the case of Hamas starting this, and in the case of Hezbollah for agreeing to join in the war in support of Hamas. But I think you have to also talk about Israel. Why are we in this situation? Why did Israel not withdraw from the Shebaa farms on the Lebanese frontier? Why have we had a siege and blockade of Gaza by Israel? Why has Israel expanded its colonization in the West Bank? That's the background against which we have to understand resistance. Whether it's a correct decision or not, it's almost inevitable sooner or later, if not from Hamas, from someone else. If not in this generation, in 5 or 10 years from another generation. So I think that those narrow questions should be asked, pulling back and looking at a larger historical perspective. This has been 100 years of war, and it obviously is into its second century. For a while, it's been into its second century. And it's not going to end very quickly simply by saying, well, we shouldn't resist. They're going to continue, whether it's taking over the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the way they took over the Haram al-Ibrahimi in Khalil, in Hebron, whether it's continuing to push Palestinians off their land in the West Bank, whether it's continuing to steal properties in occupied Arab East Jerusalem, whether it's, I mean, the things that happen daily in the occupied territories before this war began are going to sooner or later produce resistance. People will not be pushed off their land. People will not have their properties stolen. People will not allow settlers to take over their land. Your choice is essentially annihilation and subjugation or resistance. And it's not because they necessarily want to resist. It's because really, literally, Israel and the United States give them absolutely no choice. And I think that has to be better understood in the Arab world. For all the costs that it's going to impose on the Arab world, and it's imposed costs. It's imposed costs on Jordan, imposed costs obviously on Lebanon, imposed costs on Egypt, on Syria, on every Arab country, on Yemen, certainly. And those are choices that none of those peoples or governments made. Those are choices that, for that matter, the Palestinian and Lebanese people didn't make. They were made for them by these groups. But that's the situation we're in today, and I think we have to look at it in that perspective.
Rashid, and I'm going to try to make this my last question because I know we're taking a lot of your time. But with the presidential elections in the US, again, as you say, this is an Israeli-American war. With the US elections coming up, how would a change in administration impact the situation? And before you answer this question, I have to tell you that there is in the Arab world, especially in Egypt, there seem to be two points of view here. One is just like, we share, there doesn't matter, right? It's like Pepsi versus Coca-Cola, Democrats, Republicans, that's a strategic interest. And then interestingly enough, and I know this is going to surprise you, maybe, there is another narrative that actually if Trump takes over, that is good for us in the region, because he's going to bring this war to an end and he's not going to be so pro-Israel.
Mhm.
So what would you say to that? Is that actually true? Does it
Yeah.
matter?
I mean, let me answer that last part first. Trump is so unpredictable that anybody who thinks that they know what he's going to do does not know what they're talking about. He is literally capable of doing anything. He has no principles. He has no knowledge of the world. He is surrounded by people who are the most ideologically extreme people in the American political spectrum and who are capable of anything. I mean, I could see anything from Trump trying to stop the war to Trump allowing Israel to use nuclear weapons. He's capable of literally anything on that spectrum. And anybody who says he's going to do that literally does not know what they're talking about. He might. And he might do anything in between, allowing Israel to do exactly as it pleases, which more or less is what the current administration is doing, by the way. It's that would represent no change, or virtually no change. As far as what a Harris administration might do, I think that the options are much more open, but I don't think that they're particularly positive. There is no indication in anything that she has said or done from the moment that she entered politics until today, and from the moment that she became vice president until today, and from the moment she became the nominee of the Democratic Party until today, that indicates the slightest deviation in any way from the consensus of the American political establishment, which is support of Israel must be absolute, and whatever you say cannot be matched with actions that would actually force Israel to change its behavior. I have seen no indication from this woman or from the Democratic Party or from the foreign policy advisors who are going to be around her that they see things any differently than the current administration does, or that they see anything different from that consensus, which is Israel can do whatever it wants, and the United States sometimes can bleat and whine and moan, but will always enable Israel to continue doing whatever it decides to do. Now, that has not always been the case in the past. Almost every previous American president has decided that American national interests dictate that Israel be stopped or that something be done. I could describe case after case. Eisenhower over Sinai in 1956. Kissinger and Nixon over the disengagement agreements in 1973 and 75. Bush and Baker over loan guarantees. Various presidents over sales of weapons to Saudi Arabia. I could go on and on. Every American president, with few exceptions, has decided that in the American national interest, for strategic reasons, it was imperative to force Israel to do something. Israel was forced into the disengagement agreements. Israel was forced to accept the Camp David agreements in 1978. This has not yet happened with either Trump or this president. And I'm afraid that I have no reason for assuming it will happen under a Harris presidency. On the other hand, I think that after the elections, and once there's a new president, it may be possible for whichever president is in the White House in January of 2025 to tell the Israelis, Kifaya ba, it's enough. That the harm that's being done to the American image in the world and to its standing as the supporter of a rules-based international order, which has become a meaningless term, is gravely compromised. and that they're harming themselves as well as the United States, which is manifest to even intelligent Israelis. There can be no positive end for Israel in what they're doing today. This ridiculous sentiment of victory is going to disappear very quickly. And American politicians may be, whether it's Trump or whether it's Harris, may be able to finally persuade the Israelis in their own interest and in the American national interest. Enough. Maybe in February or January or March, or maybe next October.
I think for the interest of the planet, and I'm just have to interject here, I think for the interest of the whole planet and the human species, we would be better off having Harris win that elections. Rashid, I want to end on something positive. And I get so many comments here saying, how this was a very rich conversation, but I think you've said so many or alluded to so many positive things that are going on despite all the costs, the weapons sale, the changing of public opinion and whatnot. So do you think that we are in overall, and you're a historian, so the longue durée, are we in a bad, bleak moment, as bad as it gets, or are we at the end of the tunnel where things are bound to change? Where are we taking the longue durée?
I mean, my escape from that kind of question is to say that the job description of a historian does not include predicting the future. And I'm not going to predict the future. I don't know. It's like asking somebody in 1941, how is World War II going to end? Well, we're in the beginning of the war. We may be in the beginning of a much longer war, much wider war. Inshallah, ya Rab, we are not. And it will end in weeks or months. But I can't tell you that. I can tell you that in the longue durée, as a very distinguished historian who's passed away, Tony Judd, said, this is a project that has missed its time. This is a project which in the 18th century might have succeeded. In the 21st century, in the long run, it cannot succeed. Israel will have to be transformed. It cannot continue as it's going. Sooner or later, the limits of force will impose themselves. Sooner or later, the destruction that this is doing in the region is going to become manifest, not just to public opinion in the West, but to Western governments and Western elites. That's not the case now. I don't know when it will be. Inshallah, it will be soon, but I don't know. But sooner or later, in my mind, there's no question. I think that some of the trends that we're seeing now, I'm not sure about this, but I think some of the trends that we're seeing now may become permanent. And if they do, this is a historic shift. I mean, you have never had majority opposition in Western public opinion to what Israel does. Never in 100 and however many years it's been since Balfour. Since this war really began as a great power war to support the Zionist project. And that's a shift of historic importance. It could shift back. I'm not saying it's a permanent shift. But if the trend continues, this is of enormous importance. World is changing. There was one unipolar superpower when the Soviet Union disappeared. It's no longer the case. You have 2 or 3 other enormously powerful states and multiple states that have regional power. And they're going to have a bigger and bigger role in deciding on how the world is organized. It's now organized by the victors of World War II, the people who have a veto in the Security Council. The United Nations is run by them. There is no United Nations. There's an American veto, there's a Russian veto, and there's a British and a French and a Chinese veto. That's the United Nations. That world is gone. It's gone. Britain and France don't count for very much anymore. They're important, but they don't count for very much. And you have Russia, and you have the United States, and you have China, and you have India. And then you have countries like Brazil and Indonesia, which are going to become infinitely more important in the next few decades. And all of these countries, with very few exceptions, look very dimly on what Israel is doing.
Absolutely.
Very dimly.
Africa.
Very, very dimly. Even India, you should see the negative reaction to the policies, the pro-Israel policies of the Modi government in India. And that's true even in countries that support Israel. The very few countries that support Israel. The public opinion is shifting in that direction. So, in that sense, I'm of course optimistic. There's also changes that are taking place in Israel. Look at the people who are leaving Israel. It's the best and the brightest. Look at the hospital sector. Look at the high-tech sector. Look at capital inflows. Look at the Israeli gross domestic product. Look at the Israeli bond rating. I mean, some of them are temporary. But if this continues, they're not going to be temporary. I mean, you already have huge numbers of people of the Israeli elite who've decided, I don't want my children to serve in these wars. I don't want to be part of this nationalistic, chauvinistic, racist, supremacist ideology. They can't take it, even if they're patriotic Israelis, even if they're Zionists. They realize the direction Israel's taking is one that they can't support. So I think that those are changes that we should be watching in the long term. Whether they will continue, I don't know. Again, you can't predict the future, but they make me optimistic.
Yeah, but you gave us also enough ammunition from a historical point of view that would allow us to sort of project or see the horizons in a different way. Rashid, I cannot thank you enough, and I hope you know how appreciative me and my co-organizer Khalid Al-Arab from the Middle East Studies Center are grateful for you for taking the time in the midst of that very, very busy schedule. And I know how busy you are and the demands you have. I just want to tell everyone that one, we will definitely have Rashid in person and Mona sometime, inshallah, soon.
Inshallah.
And the other thing, this talk is recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel and the Facebook channel of Alternative Policy Solutions, the project that I proudly run. Thank you, Rashid, for being who you are, for walking the talk, for being an excellent academic, a committed academic, gracious, funny, intelligent, and, no whitewashing or anything that I see a lot among academics. And of course, no upmanship of, revolutionary Puritanism, that to which we suffer from. Thank you so much, Rashid.
شكرا جزيلا.
And thank you all for being here. We're going to end now. Bye, everyone. Bye, Rashid. سلم على منى.
الله يسلمك.
Bye.